Well, thank you, Sherry. It really is an honor to be here today, and I haven't even seen the industry exhibit. This is such a fabulous museum. I've only gotten to the Great Depression, but I did see one piece of pig iron, so yay. I'm going to miss Sherry saying, Karen, can we please have? And I was like, yes, and I was always prompt, wasn't I, Sherry? Always. Well, again, it is such an honor to be here today, and this presentation is it's entitled Sloss Furnaces, the Industrial Evolution of Birmingham's Iron Plantation. And if you're not familiar with Sloss Furnaces is the only 20th century blast furnace in the United States that is currently being preserved and interpreted as an industrial museum, which really doesn't speak highly of how this country preserves its industrial sites. And what we did at Sloss Furnaces, we produced pig iron and giant bars of pig iron, and we produced this pig iron from 1882 until 1970. And I always do these presentations and I never tell anybody what pig iron is, so I'm going to tell it right off the bat. When you tap one of these giant furnaces, all this molten iron would go spewing out into a channel. And it would go into these, it would go into the main channel, and then it would go into these kind of curved channels down this huge cast shed. And then it would go into these small pig moles underneath these channels. Well, the channels, the workers referred to them as sows, and the pig moles as piglets, because the way they were pressed into the sand, it looked like little baby piglets suckling at their mother. So there you have it. It's not that exciting, but that's why it's called pig iron. Okay, now one thing I want to start out with, because I also teach at UAB, and I've been at UAB for a very long time, and I teach a course on occasion called Southern Industry. And when I first started teaching this Southern Industry course, I was really surprised how often my students just didn't seem to understand the correlation between science and history. They looked at it as being completely unrelated. And I decided, well, I'm going to use Birmingham as an example of this tie that history and science have together, because this is not true. And of course, the development of the industrial city of Birmingham is a perfect example, because in Birmingham, history and science, or rather history and geology, combined to make a city unlike any other city in the United States. And what I mean by this, most cities develop along rivers and some kind of railway or highways, but it's really not, although rail was very important to Birmingham, it's really not these surface features that enticed the city's founders. It was what was beneath the surfaces. And as the slide says, there's over 190 different minerals. You can see the exhibit on geology in this wonderful museum. They did a fabulous job. I have a good friend at the McWane Center, and he came down here from Chicago to be the director of collections at McWane. I said, what brought you to Birmingham? He said, are you kidding me? Alabama is like the most diverse state in the Union. And so, and that's what has gotten me over the years to start looking at the scientific aspect, or the science of it. Now, this city, the city of Birmingham, which is actually located, it was called the Jones Valley area. It would not exist today if not for a very unique geological formation. This is a very crude map that I've had for about 20 years, but I can't find anything better. So, this begins like 280 million years ago, and this is when you've got this geological formation that's going to create the Appalachian Mountains. Where is Birmingham located? At the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. And so it also creates all the necessary ingredients needed to make iron and eventually steel. Now, Birmingham was started on iron, not steel. Steel came later. In fact, at Sloss, we don't say the S word. It was iron. Okay, so the three ingredients needed to make iron, the type of iron, was coal, iron ore, and limestone. And the one unique thing, because again, rather crude picture here, but you can see how we're located in this basin. And the three ingredients needed to make iron and eventually steel are all found within a 30-mile radius of one another. This is an incredibly unique situation. In fact, the discovery of coal along Alabama's rivers, you can trace it back. There are journals of men coming back from the Battle of New Orleans, from the War of 1812, who left journals who talk about this area of Alabama and the coal seams. It was part of the Mississippi Territory during that particular period of time. But anyway, because of these materials, you are going to see the development of a lot of industry in this particular area. Again, this was the Jones Valley area. Now, none of this, well, it's not just blast furnaces. You're going to see limestone quarries, you're going to see coal mines, you're going to see red ore mines. The Birmingham Industrial District has very, very long arms. Anniston, Coleman, it reached out. The majority, though, in that valley called Jones Valley. None of this, however, is going to happen until the end of the Civil War. Yes, I know we did have industry in the state of Alabama. We had Briarfield and we had the Selma Iron Works, but nothing like what the North had. So following the Civil War in 1865, Alabama's economy, especially around the central Alabama, it's going to shift. It's going to change from the dominance of agriculture. And this is what people like Sloss want. And what happens, you have in 1871, prominent Alabamians like Henry de Bartoleben and William Powell and James Sloss and a man by the name of Truman Aldrich. Truman Aldrich was actually a mining engineer from New York. There were a lot of northern mining engineers and engineers of all types that will come south after the Civil War, because they know about this desire to develop the first industrial city in the South, and they want to be a part of it. So these guys are all going to join forces to form the city of Birmingham. Again, why in the Jones Valley area? Because like I said, this was the only place in the country. These guys knew these ingredients were there. They knew about the iron and the limestone and of course the coal, but they needed to figure out this is going to be the only industrial city in the world that doesn't have access to what? It's not exactly Mobile. There's no port that I know of. We've got the Cahaba, but you know, that's about it. We don't want to trample those lilies. So, so again, one of these guys was James Withers Sloss, and he was a North Alabama merchant and he was a railroad man. If not for rail, no Birmingham. Sloss was born in Mooresville, Alabama in 1820. And he was born into a family that had actually migrated over from Ireland in the early 1800s. And men like Sloss knew that one of the reasons why the South lost the Civil War is because they had no industry. And you know, men like Sloss were tired of reading about this colonial relationship between the North and the South. And they knew that they could make industry. They knew they could do the same thing. So following the Civil War, they're bound and determined to start industrializing. It was the only way the South was going to rebuild. And it was, you know, the only way that it's going to be a huge part of this booming industrial revolution. The United States gets into the Industrial Revolution a little bit later than other countries because obviously after the Civil War for 20 years, we're trying to put ourselves back together. But when we get there, nobody can catch us. All right, so what Sloss needed to do, again, rather crude 1892 map, he's determined to develop a relationship with this enterprise that had emerged as the strongest railroad in the South. And this is the L&N, the Louisville and Nashville. Now, Sloss realized that the L&N had reached a critical stage in its growth, and that the president, who was located in Nashville, wanted access to Mobile, Alabama, and he wanted access to Montgomery, that's how I was told to say it. So Sloss goes up and sees the president of the L&N, and his name was Albert Fink. And he goes up and he tells him, if you're going through Montgomery and Mobile, all the way to Mobile, then you've got to go through the Jones Valley area. And so he really wanted this tie between the L&N Railroad and this company right here. This is the Elington Land Company, and the Elington Land Company owned all the rich land in the Jones Valley area, but they ran out of money. They were about to go bankrupt, which would be very unusual to have any bankruptcy in Jefferson County. So he goes to Albert Fink with this glowing picture of the mineral district of the Jones Valley area and all the future rail line, and he offers to lease his railroad if that line would assume all of these debts. So they do this. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I can't believe I turned it off. It's crickets. If you hear it, it kind of goes in with this. It kind of goes in with this photo. This is a fabulous photo. This is First Avenue, and this is the Elington Land Company. I actually stole this picture from Jim Bennett. So if you see Jim, tell him thank you. But what is wonderful about this, the L&N says, okay, we'll do it. Not only do they decide to lay all this track through Birmingham, they end up investing over $30 million in the state of Alabama. They invest in mines, they invest in furnaces, steamship lines, all types of Alabama operations. In fact, at this particular period of time, a local Birmingham newspaper stated, this is a little bit later, but Sloss's decision to bring in the L&N transformed Birmingham from a squalid jumble of tents, shanties, and boxcars into a thriving community. Now, this is the poster that highlighted Birmingham. If you saw postcards of early Birmingham at the turn of the century, they were all these sooty blast furnaces. Well, now, if we look at this today and we're looking for a place to move and raise our children, this is the last place that we would want to go by looking at this promotional poster, because it's all this soot, and look at the air and the dangerous jobs and the molten iron. But what did this mean to people at this particular period of time? This smog and this molten iron and these dangerous positions. This is money. This is going to put South on the industrial map. So during the 1880s, as pig iron production in Alabama grows from 68,000 to 700,000 gross tons, you have got 19 to 20 blast furnaces that are going to be built. And they're going to be built only in Jefferson County. That's not counting the furnaces that are going to be built outside of Jefferson County. In fact, Andrew Carnegie, who's the famous, of course, northern steel entrepreneur, he will call this area of the South Pennsylvania's most formidable industrial enemy. Well, the first furnace is going to be built on First Avenue, and it is going to be built by Henry de Bartleben. This is the Alice Furnace, and the Alice Furnace was named after his daughter. And in 1880, with the backing of Henry de Bartleben, you're going to have the second furnace in Birmingham, and this is James Withers Sloss Furnace. And I could talk for hours about the intricacies of type of stoves and furnaces and smokestacks and everything that he did so differently to make this such a modern blast furnace. But Sherry will throw something at me if I do that. Okay, so, but Sloss not only builds these giant blast furnaces and these stoves and everything else that goes with this particular site to produce this pig iron, he is a proponent, like Rockefeller and Carnegie, of vertical integration, of kind of owning everything that you need to get your product to market. So in other words, he ends up purchasing limestone quarries, coke ovens, because you don't really put coal into a top of a furnace, you put coke. And so you have to cook coal to make it coke. Again, I won't go into that, but he buys all of this stuff, and red ore mines, and it's all surrounding Birmingham. And this plant becomes quite successful. So not surprising, by the late 1880s, Birmingham was booming. We all know it earns the nickname the Magic City because, again, it grows so rapidly from 1871. Now, this is all a part of the emerging New South. Birmingham, Alabama wasn't even incorporated. When you look at the history and you walk around these wonderful exhibits, Birmingham is a very new city. It is a product of what these guys wanted to do, and they were very successful. They wanted a city of the New South, and this is it, Birmingham, Alabama. Okay, let's go back to Mr. Sloss. What happens to him? Well, James Withers Sloss, this is kind of much later, and I'll get to this, but in 1889, he only owns this company for 8 or 9 years. He's having some problems. He had used the convict labor, and he was having some problems with that. He had some political issues. He just had a lot of turnover, and he was very proud of what he had accomplished, but he'd kind of had enough. He was a wonderful developer and promoter, but he didn't really like to manage. So what he does, in 1889, he's going to sell out, but he wants to sell out to Southerners. So he sells out to a group of Southern entrepreneurs out of Virginia who also have ties to New York, who will take the company public. And so this company, so he sells out for $2 million. This is, good in 1889. And so he sells out, and these guys change the name of the company. They change the name of the company to Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron. And I'll go back to this in just a minute. But anyway, they change the name of the company because what they want to do more than anything is get into the making of steel. Everybody's, into steel now. But then they realized with TCI coming in and all of these other industries that are making steel, they got together up in New York and they said, why don't we just keep making what we know how to make? And that was the smartest move. And somebody said, well, let's just leave the name in case we ever make steel again. So they never changed the name. It's Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron, but they never made steel. They just stuck to, making what they knew how to make. This picture of Birmingham, again, this is First Avenue, and you've got, this was used as a promotional photo. And you've got Sloss polluting away in the back, but that's money. Okay, one thing that when it becomes Sloss Sheffield Steel and Iron, they just decide to greatly expand, meaning they build 4 new furnace sites. They also decide to build more, not only blast furnaces, but they expand their mining and their quarry operations. And they buy up these mining, or they invest in these mining communities, and they start and develop a lot of these mining communities. Of course, we all know they have wonderful names. These aren't the ones that actually Sloss owned, but Ishkuda and Winona, they had an article in the Birmingham News about the unique names of Birmingham mining communities. But Coalburg and all of these other ones, Irondale, we will get ore or limestone from all of these particular places. This just gives you an idea, again, rather a crude little map, but it just gives you an idea. This is actually an original map from the 20s, and I thought it was wonderful. And of course, the bottom right hand, when you have all these mining sites, you have to have some place for people to live, and I'll address that in just a minute. Okay, so by World War I, the company will grow to become the largest merchant pig iron producer in the world. This is just a sea of pig iron. And Sloss not only supplied local foundries and pipe making shops, but they also shipped iron to companies all over the world. And they also sold a lot of iron to governments all over the world. In fact, our very first shipment of pig iron went out through the port city of New Orleans in 1882 to Liverpool, England. Now, most of our customers are going to be later on here in the United States, but again, it's just a perfect example. what kind of a grade of iron this was. Once you could get the nasty impurities out of red ore, then you have the best iron in the world. And how do you do that? You throw limestone in the top of that blast furnace and it sucks out all the nasty impurities. Okay, one thing though that Sloss greatly needed to do, they needed to modernize. We're going into the 1920s, okay? So between 1927 and 1931, Sloss is going to make some major and much needed technological changes, meaning they update. They pretty much, if you go out to Sloss today, and what you see out there, everything is from the 1920s. Our blowing engine building, which is fabulous, is from 1905. But everything was kind of torn down and rebuilt. The two furnaces were rebuilt, and what all of this does, I won't go into all the technological components of this, but what it does, it doubles the plant's production capacity. This is a perfect example. On the left, from the 1800s into the mid-1920s, when we would tap that furnace and it would go out into those channels, you had African-American workers that would break this up by hand. They took 15-minute shifts and they had these double handle hammers, and it was grueling work. Okay, and then we finally install an automatic pig casting machine. Now when you tap the furnace, it goes out into one channel and it goes into that giant ladle car. I love this guy standing next to it, he's so proud. And then it goes into these revolving tracks of pig iron. I mean, this is like the big duh principle. Why didn't you do this earlier? The sad thing is, okay, Birmingham's the city of the New South. The early leaders, the early head of these industries, they had owned plantations. They used the type of labor that they were familiar with. They were familiar with raw materials and cheap labor. But the gentleman that designs this, Edward Ewing, the automatic pig casting machine at the turn of the century, nobody at Sloss wants anything to do with it. And so he sells it, the patent, to Andrew Carnegie. But we finally implement it in 1931. And the only reason why we do, I think we actually implemented it. I have 1931, it was a little earlier. Because we finally get second, third generation Birmingham individual who's quite the progressive, and he becomes president, and his name was Hugh Morrow. Now, so you have all these changes going on at Sloss, and this is Sloss during World War II. Obviously, our greatest time of production will be the war years. Now, this is hard to see, but it is, the problem was, once we mechanized, the managers were very worried, and they were worried because their customers were worried. They're like, wait a minute, we always liked your pig iron before, what is it going to be now? So one of the vice presidents decides to publish a quarterly magazine, and it was called Pig Iron Rough Notes. And it went all over the country, and it kept its customers up on what they were doing. And anybody who wanted to talk about their foundry business could publish in this little magazine. It is a fabulous little magazine. There's pictures of during the war years, even the advertisements in them are just amazing. Now, during World War II, of course, the magazine talked about what iron was doing for the war effort. It wasn't just a steel war. Most of the hand grenades of World War II made out of Sloss iron. And you had Caterpillar that would advertise. And this is the first copy, 1927. Now, one thing I noticed when I first came to Sloss, on the back page of every one of these rough notes was a recipe page, and it said, "Cooks are gentlemen. Cooking is a noble science." And I thought, what is this? So I got all the pig iron rough notes, went down to the archives, I'm looking through every last page. There is like muskrat stew or corn chowder. And so I took all of those recipes and I got with UA Press and we made a little book called Man Food, and you don't want to cook any of it. It's just kind of like fun stuff. But this magazine is just wonderful. Let's see, did I want to go back? Okay, one thing about, I'm showing you all these fabulous pictures during World War II. Before World War II is the Great Depression. The only reason why Sloss didn't completely shut down during the Great Depression, and it did shut down for a while, is because they modernized. If not for that, they would have never opened their doors up again. So the Great Depression cripples Birmingham. In fact, I think Roosevelt calls the South during the Great Depression the nation's #1 economic problem. So, I mean, times were, it was awful. There's a wonderful exhibit out there that looks at Alabama during the Great Depression. And of course, what gets us out of the Great Depression is World War II. And World War II is going to expand the market, greatly expand the market for iron and steel. It's going to create a lot of jobs for Birmingham workers. And by 1941, when Americans enter the war, nearly half of the labor force will be employed by iron, steel, and mining. These three industries. And more than two-thirds of the laborers were African American. And despite being dominated by African American workers, and we're all familiar with this story, but at this time, segregation in the industrial workplace wasn't just happening in the South. It was happening all over the United States. So again, the industrial workplace is going to be, very segregated until the 1960s. And what I mean by this, these men worked together, but they, had separate bathhouses, they punched separate time clocks, they attended separate company picnics. More important, though, you had the segregation of jobs, and it's going to be this way till about the 1960s. The company's going to operate kind of like a hierarchy. At that very top tier, you have the chemists and the managers and the furnace keepers and the welders. And then at the middle tier, you have the furnace tappers, and they're assisted by African Americans. But my point is, most of the labor at Sloss was African American. And for a very long period of time, from 1826, maybe not that early, until 1928, every industry is going to be assisted by this. This is a story, this is the convict leasing system, and Sloss Furnace, I had always been told when I first got there, well, we never used convict labor. Well, I did a whole lot of research, and we did indeed use convict labor. We did not use it at the plant, but I have found maps of the Kohlberg mine, and there are prisons on that. I have found Sloss Furnaces convict leasing records book down in the archives. So this system was used. I think we are very familiar with it. Unfortunately, it is a horrific part of Alabama history. But with that said, I guess if you have to look at anything positive about this, I was talking to an African American man, and he was telling me that his dad had been one of these convict laborers, but learned the mining industry, and when he got out, he became a miner. So, that was like the only positive story. But with that said, it is we're the last state to outlaw it, just because the state government, from leasing these men, made around $200 million by today's standards. Okay, but how did most of these workers live when they were away from the plant? Well, Birmingham, very unique in this situation, that there were company towns and company houses all over the Birmingham area. As Birmingham's population begins to boom, you have got immediately Sloss building Sloss quarters. Why company housing? This is a way to, keep family men. They had a horrible turnover situation, so family men were, like to stay, because they had more of a vested interest. And another reason why they wanted houses right next to the furnace is simply because if there's an emergency at 3 in the morning, then they could go down into the quarters and get the guys to come up and help, because blast furnaces don't shut down. Sloss is going to build, unfortunately, I have no pictures of Sloss quarters. Sloss is going to build 48 houses next to their site. These two pictures of where they're working on the roads, behind them, that's the commissary, and to the right, That happens to be the infirmary, and you can kind of see in this picture to the left some of the Sloss quarters, and that's really the only pictures. These were typical shotgun houses, and the company provided electricity. Later on, they provided electricity. In the early years, there was no electricity, nor water, but later on, they certainly did provide that. And the residents called it the quarters. Again, there's a huge need for these houses because you have got thousands of sharecroppers who are just pouring into Birmingham to live, to work, in these either the mines or some type of industry. And I interviewed a woman who was born and raised in the quarters, and her name was Mary Harris, and she recalled the following, and they called it going north when times were hard. So the reason my family came to Birmingham was because cotton went down to nothing. You couldn't get a real bale of cotton. Cotton was $40 a bale. Everything went to dropping. If you farming, you couldn't pay the landlords. You couldn't pay your bills. And of course, we've all seen these pictures. All these individuals were tied up into either the crop lien system or the sharecropping system. And it wasn't just African Americans that were tied into this system, it was poor whites as well. Now you also had, when I moved to Birmingham about 21 years ago, I remember telling my mom, I'm going to be the only Catholic Italian in Birmingham, Alabama. And then when I came, all these Italians and these Greeks and these Lebanese, why? Because it was a magnet for European immigrants as well. They came from all over the world to come to Birmingham. They worked in the mines for a while, the Italians did, but they got out as soon as they could. And they, of course, started the service industry, grocery stores or cafes. All right, but back to the quarters very quickly. The quarters provided a very cohesive community for these workers. No, it wasn't the Ritz, but when my great-grandparents came over and moved to Missouri to work in the coal mines, they lived in the same kind of company housing. But these people all came from the same area of the Black Belt of Alabama. So they had the same customs and the same traditions and the same problems. And so for years, the quarters was a very safe and supported place to live. And when I talked to these women who were born and raised there, because they didn't tear it down until the 60s, they talked about watermelon cuttings and chitlin parties and all kinds of, community activities. And like I said, there was a commissary, and they used for years something called clacker, which was kind of a script, and it just kept them tied into the company. But they got rid of clacker in 1920. But when you talk to these people, they always talk about they all seem to mention one individual, and that was the doctor who took care of them. And he not only took care of the people living in the quarters, but he took care of the gentlemen that were burned or whatever kind of injury that you would happen to get at a blast furnace. But I interviewed one of the workers, and this doctor's name was Dr. McQueen, and he told me, when the children were sick, he'd come to your house and tended them. When my oldest child had pneumonia, Dr. McQueen was right there. He delivered my first baby at the house for $15. And again, the quarters will be torn down in the 1960s. It becomes too expensive to maintain. And also, African American men who went off to fight in World War II had access to the GI Bill. So when they came back home, they could get a house that wasn't located under a blast furnace. But this one thing that the children of Sloss, this is a great picture of the Thomas School. It's the Jimmy Hill Mission now, but the Thomas School was built in the 20s for African American children, so the kids of Sloss could go there. Church was the core, it was the foundation, it was the heart and soul of the black community. When James Sloss in the 1880s said, I'm going to build company housing, the men are like, well, Mr. Sloss, if you build this housing, turn one of these shotguns into a church, because my wife is not coming up if there's no place to worship. And later on, New Hope Baptist Church started in the quarters, and it's still in North Birmingham today. This was huge. This is the first integrated activity in Birmingham, Alabama, baseball. Whites went to black games, blacks went to white games, and I'm not talking about, this is a SIPCO, there were white teams, black teams, but people brought their families. Look at these photos of African Americans at these games. They're dressed up. The bottom right-hand photo is from the 1920s. You've got blacks and whites sitting together in the bleachers. So this was truly the first integrated activity. And where do you think the Black Barons and all these other great baseball players came out of? Willie Mays, Satchel Paige. They all started somewhere. Okay. I know, I'm getting close. All right, back to what was happening to Sloss very quickly. Well, following World War II, we do really well during World War II, of course, and then after World War II, not so great. In the 1950s, things are going to change, primarily because Sloss Furnaces get sold to U.S. Pipe. And after it gets sold to U.S. Pipe, it's not so much that it was mismanagement, yes, but it just got too big. And so you're going to see the iron and steel industry really start to go down in Birmingham. And there are a number of reasons. Yes, mismanagement, but also because a lot of our iron went into the making of steel. Now steel companies are using what? Scrap iron. And you have ductile iron, which is much more flexible iron. People are getting everything from overseas. Everybody brags about the Marshall Plan. It was fabulous. We rebuilt Europe up in the 50s, but we weren't rebuilding our sites at home. The Clean Air Act of 1970. Everybody said, well, Sloss air isn't that bad, or Birmingham air isn't that bad. Men told me they had to have 2 changes of shirts if they went out for lunch, so probably was kind of bad. So what happens, Sloss is going to be the last remaining blast furnace. It's going to be shut down in 1970. So what happens after it's shut down? Well, the land is donated to the Alabama State Fair Authority, and they said they were going to build a park or a museum, and nobody could figure out what to do with Sloss Furnaces. So it just falls apart. And in the late 70s, they just decide to tear it down. And when the citizens of Birmingham hear about this, they're like, no, you've torn down our beautiful railroad station. Birmingham had a beautiful terminal, one of the most gorgeous in the Southeast. And they said, this is the last remaining tie to our history. No, it may not be the prettiest thing, but you're not tearing it down. And so they literally had men and women put together the Sloss Furnace Association, and they were able to push through a $3.3 million bond. You've got the federal government that gets involved into it, and it is finally open. It took forever to put it back together. It's finally open to the public in 1983. It's designated as a National Historic Landmark in 1981, and today, it really preserves everything about Birmingham's past, whether it be its ties to railroad or segregation. This is the defining institution in Birmingham because it speaks to our history, whether it be, in a negative light or a positive light. So today we do these wonderful education tours. We do outreach programs. Oh, I have this on here because we just had a wonderful UAB had a archaeology dig, and they came out and they found the cornerstone to our company housing, and they found 1,900 artifacts. And they found dog tags and they found everything. And they do all kinds of these archaeological digs. This one, I just have the machine shop because they found the cornerstone to the machine shop as well. And this is Jack Berkstresser and Bodie Miller. Metal Arts program is alive and well. We offer classes on all types of metallurgy, and it's just wonderful. We do these iron pours for children, and when they come through and they do an iron pour and they design a scratch block, they go home with an actual piece of pig iron instead of just walking around the site and then going home and saying, I have no idea what I just saw. If you're holding that piece of pig iron, then you know. Reunions, I have 2 reunions a year. They're just amazing. They tell me these stories. They get bigger and bigger every year, so I'm kind of wondering. But they are wonderful. This is the most popular event at Sloss right now. My daughter got married in October, and no, she did not get married at Sloss Furnaces, but We have 40 weddings already booked. So if you're planning on getting married, then come to Sloss. Okay. Thank you all so much. Okay, do you have any questions or anything before I turn it over?
We have 5 minutes for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand. Marcus or I will give you a microphone to speak into, and so that it will be recorded on the video.
That house that's there now, where did that, was that moved from another location?
Repeat the question, please.
Oh, the house?
The house that's there now?
Okay, there is a white house on site. That was brought about 30 years ago. The first director convinced the president of the Birmingham Historical Society, Marjorie White, to move everything down there, and they brought that big white house, and she's still down there today. My office is in that house. I have a fireplace. It's wonderful. The little house behind it, that is a shotgun house that we went out and literally grabbed and picked up and stuck it on the Sloss site. And we just received a grant to refurbish it. We want to show people, you know, where they can walk around and look in to see how people lived during that particular period of time. Yes, sir.
I got here a bit late. You may have addressed this already. I visited Sloss Furnaces. What was the main product that they made there? Was it
pig iron.
And what was the use of pig iron?
The use of pig iron was cast iron pipe, and it went into stoves in the early years in product, but later on it was mainly used for cast iron pipe. And actually later on, towards the 1950s and 60s, we made more money by selling our byproducts, meaning that when you tap iron, there is a product floating around in the blast furnace. Remember I talked about you added limestone to pull out the impurities? Well, those impurities would float around on top, and they would tap those impurities every 2 hours, and it was slag. And we had a concrete plant on site and made concrete. And we tapped the gases, and we sold these gases. So byproducts, actually later on, we made more money by that. But most of the pig iron was used, a lot of different products, but primarily cast iron. And no, I didn't address that. That was a very good question. Yes. Yes, sir.
You mentioned how much money the state of Alabama made off of convict leasing.
Yes.
I was wondering if, in your research, if you got a sense of the percentage of Sloss's profits.
No, I have an intern this semester, and that is one of the things he's looking at. You have to understand, and I have to be very careful. I've just put out a monograph on the convict leasing system, and it was just not a topic. I was told on numerous occasions, maybe, why don't you do something on this instead? And I'm retiring from Sloss in 18 months, so I thought, well, I'm going to go ahead and do it now. So, but anyway, we are just now delving into that. And it was a lot. It was a lot. Because on the Kohlberg map, there's not only, it says male prison, but there's a female prison as well for, you know, female prisoners. And they probably cooked, did laundry for the minors. Okay, good question. Come back to me and email me. All right.
Time for one more question. Anyone?
Yes, sir.
The sewage systems, I know probably most of them are cast iron.
Yes.
Probably the whole United States probably benefited from Sloss.
Absolutely. And you know, when kids come out there and like, well, big deal, cast iron pipe, and I'm like, yeah, well, think about that when you flush the toilet next time, you know. But no, I don't say that. But you know, everything now went to plastic pipes. But if you notice, the SIPCO and everything, they're all going back to the cast iron again because it lasts so much longer. So I live in such an old area of Birmingham, I found out my pipes are terracotta, and that just does not sound good. So.
Thank you all for coming.
Yes,
today.
thank you.
And,